Hey guys, Level Cap here. Today I want to talk about movies and documentaries about World War II that can help you understand the context of a lot of the battles we'll be fighting in Battlefield 5. Now, we already know that Battlefield 5 is DICE's version of World War II, which allows them to incorporate non-historically accurate stuff into the game, which I'm totally fine with, but it does still help, or it adds more value to me at least, knowing the historical context of each battle, why these battles were being fought, what time during the war they were being fought, what the significance of them was overall. And watching movies and documentaries about the subject matter is a great way to learn about it and sort of understand it, and it adds so much more value to my understanding or my appreciation of the details that go into each battle. Now, to start off, I would highly recommend watching the documentary series called World War II in Color. This will give you a great overall overview of the war, not just the battles, but the lead up to the war. I think the first episode is super interesting to give you a good idea of the formation of the Nazi Party and Mussolini and all the stuff that went on early in the war, as it is so significant and so interesting to basically understand how we got into the war in the first place and how some of the first battles were fought and how the Axis powers formed and worked together. Now, it is a 13-part series and you don't have to watch it all at once, but especially the early episodes are going to explain some of the early battles of the war, which are going to be the battles that we fight when Battlefield 5 launches. DICE is releasing the battles chronologically, which is super interesting. So a lot of the early battles in the game are probably going to be battles that you haven't heard of, or not the most iconic or the most well-known battles, but are still super historically relevant and interesting. Now, the two first movies I want to recommend here involve Britain's involvement with the war. We have Dunkirk and then The Darkest Hour. Two more recent films, actually, focusing on basically how Britain was pretty much screwed in 1940. They almost had their entire infantry and land army wiped out by the Germans, by their blitzkrieg that flanked around them and basically trapped them on the coastal town of Dunkirk. And they're about to be wiped out. And the movie Dunkirk basically tells a very short and intense story about the soldiers trying to get out of there and the mobilization of the civilian fleet to help get them out of there. It also features what I believe are some of the more authentic aerial combat sequences that I've seen of any World War II aerial combat film. There's a few aerial combat movies out there, but none of them quite get the aerial combat right, or at least portray it in a realistic manner, and Dunkirk does an excellent job of this. The movie Darkest Hour is about Winston Churchill and basically how he came into power in Britain during the time of the war and just how crazy it was and how close Britain got to trying to surrender to Germany and had leaders that wanted to surrender, and how he fought back against basically crazy odds, people not wanting to fight, people feeling like they were completely outnumbered by Germany. And also it involves the Dunkirk operation a bit too, and how like they had to deal with the fact that maybe their entire army was going to get wiped out, and how were they going to fight back if that actually happened. These two movies together are very interesting. Darkest Hour doesn't really show much combat, but it's interesting nonetheless to know sort of the backstory behind Dunkirk and what was happening there. The next movie I want to talk about is called Battle for Sevastopol, and it's about the female Russian sniper Ludmila Pavlichenko, who has more confirmed kills than any other sniper in the war, I believe. One of the most decorated soldiers in Russian history, and her story is super interesting, and it also takes place earlier in World War II, fighting the German invasion of their land. And it's pretty intense. There's a lot of combat sequences in it, and it also covers a bit of her story outside of combat and the relationship she built up with Eleanor Roosevelt as she was sent over to the US to try and convince them to join the war, since Russia was like, up against the German military might and suffering massive losses. They sent some of their best soldiers over to try and encourage them to join. I highly recommend watching it, especially if you want to see sort of the involvement of female soldiers in the Russian military during the war. Pretty darn interesting subject matter. Continuing on with some of the Russian theater of war, an American-made film this time called Enemy at the Gates, which has Jude Law as a Russian sniper, Vasily Zaitsev, who was a real person who fought in the Battle of Stalingrad. And there was an alleged sniper duel between him and another German sniper, although there is some sort of question about the historical accuracy of this. It's still a really good movie showing the Battle of Stalingrad, one of the most notorious and intense battles of all of World War II. This is sort of where Germany broke on Russia. This was like where Russia was making one of their main stance against Germany to try and stop them from fully taking the country. Super interesting, and there are a bunch of other movies on Stalingrad. There's actually one just called Stalingrad that came out in 1993. It's either a German or a Russian film, and it's something that in order for me to watch it, at least with English dubbing or translation, I think I actually have to buy the movie, which is something I'm considering doing because a lot of people have said it's super good. So I'm going to check out that movie in the near future to get a little bit more Stalingrad context. The next movie in pseudo-chronological order here is called Das Boot. This is actually one of my favorite World War II movies ever made. It is incredibly good. It's a German film directed by Wolfgang Petersen, who's well known for a lot of movies, including movies like Air Force One, The Perfect Storm, Troy, all that kind of stuff. He's, of course, done a ton of German films before getting into the American film market, but Das Boot is just an incredible movie that focuses on a German U-boat during the war. It gives you a really interesting perspective on the German U-boat crews and sort of what they went through during the war, and kind of how technology caught up with the U-boat teams and how they went from being super effective to getting their asses kicked every time they tried to attack a convoy. So good film. I highly recommend this. I think I like it even more than Saving Private Ryan in terms of overall war film quality. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. Now, before we get into the American involvement in the war, there's another really interesting film called Days of Glory, which is actually about French North African forces fighting to try and free France. It's about some Algerian fighters and some Moroccan fighters, and basically how they were treated horribly during the war. And not everybody sort of talks about this aspect of the war. It's pretty well known that African Americans in World War II were treated horribly by the Americans, but the same was true for a lot of the other minority fighters during the war. And this is a really interesting story about their contribution to the war, the sacrifices they made, and the injustices afterwards. This isn't necessarily one of the most combat-intensive films ever made. There are several battles in it, but it is an interesting film nonetheless and focuses on combat and aspects of the war that probably aren't portrayed in many other films. Now, there's plenty of other movies focusing on the German involvement, Polish involvement, British, French involvement during the war. If you guys have your favorite movies on that, please recommend them. I'm not as well versed in foreign war films as I want to be, but I am all ears and looking for other stuff, so please mention them in the comments below. When it comes to America's involvement in the war, I think I'm a bit more well versed in the films there, and some of the early stuff that I would recommend, some of the best stuff I think that's been made out there is the Band of Brothers series and the Pacific series, both focusing on two entirely different aspects of the war. Band of Brothers focuses on Easy Company, which were airborne troops launched behind German lines on D-Day, and focuses on their involvement in the war. It's incredibly historically accurate. A lot of the battles and the things that happen are based directly off of what happened to actual soldiers, because a lot of it was documented through journals and writing at the time. And so it's a very, very accurate and very, very intense show. Highly recommend Band of Brothers. And the same with the Pacific, focusing more on the Pacific theater of war, very much on island hopping, clearing out islands from Japanese. It's insanely intense, an entirely different type of battle being fought over there, and really crazy to watch. Those two shows were produced by Tom Hanks and Spielberg, and apparently they're working on a new show that I think is focusing on bomber crews during the war, which I'm sure will be equally amazing. Now, of course, those productions originated a lot from the success of Saving Private Ryan, with Spielberg and Tom Hanks again making one of the most notorious World War II films ever made. If you haven't seen Saving Private Ryan, you gotta see it. For the D-Day landing sequence alone is incredibly intense. Now, when it comes to World War II movies that focus a lot on combat, I feel like the movie Fury, which focuses on an American tank crew, is one of the most action-packed World War II movies I've seen. It focuses on one specific tank crew as they make their way toward Germany and towards the end of the war in Europe, and they're fighting against some of the most dedicated German soldiers, because at that point in the war, Germany had essentially lost but just hadn't surrendered yet. So the people they were fighting were like the most zealot, the most dedicated, and they also employed children fighters who frankly didn't know any better and were willing to get closer on suicidal like missions to take out tanks and stuff. And the losses for American tank crews and just Americans in general towards the end of the war were still incredibly high and staggering because of this. And the movie does a good job of portraying that. The accuracy of the combat isn't necessarily there, and one of the battles towards the end of the film is actually a sort of realistic portrayal of something that a Russian tank crew went through earlier in the war. And so I guess they're sort of borrowing tank stories from around World War II and incorporating it into one story, which I'm okay with, but it's an interesting movie nonetheless and shows some of the best tank fighting visuals I've seen in any film. Now, there's also quite a few movies about the island hopping battles in the Pacific that the Americans fought against the Japanese. I think one of the best ones made is Letters from Iwo Jima, which is actually told from the Japanese perspective, directed by Clint Eastwood, and it's about the Battle of Iwo Jima and the Japanese that were left there to defend the island with no reinforcements and basically directives to fight to the death. And it is brutal, and it is not a romantic view of war at all. It's pretty hard to watch. Clint Eastwood also directed another movie called Flags of Our Fathers. Not quite as good as Letters from Iwo Jima in my opinion, but it tells the same story basically from the American perspective. And so those two movies together are pretty interesting. There's also the movie Thin Red Line, which is about Guadalcanal, but it's more trying to tell a different story, I think, than specifically about the battle itself and kind of about futility. And the movie's kind of all over the place. Not my favorite, but if you really want something on Guadalcanal, there's that movie. And then there's also Hacksaw Ridge, which takes place during the Battle of Okinawa, but that one, again, isn't as much about the battle itself and more about Desmond Doss, who is a conscientious objector, basically. So he's in the military but refuses to fight, refuses to kill. That's interesting from that perspective, but isn't exactly an amazing portrayal of the battle itself or gives you a lot of insight into the Battle of Okinawa. It's just really more of a smaller story within the battle. Then, of course, there's always Pearl Harbor, which shows the infamous day in which the Japanese attacked our naval base in Hawaii in the Pacific. And the movie is... it's hard to watch. I'll just say it at that. It does have some aerial combat. Some of it's better than others. There were actually 2 pilots that got airborne during the Battle of Pearl Harbor and did shoot down Japanese fighter pilots. So that part of the movie is accurate, but there's a lot of other inaccuracies in the movie. It covers some interesting aspects of the war, but it's also got a whole bunch of cheesy love story stuff tied into it, and it makes it harder to watch, and it's definitely one of those Hollywood blockbuster portrayals of World War II. Now, in terms of World War II movies that don't focus quite on the combat aspect as much, but are just more really interesting films that give you a lot of context to what's going on, the movie Downfall, which is about the Nazi regime falling out of power and basically losing the war, and Hitler's suicide and all that. Really well-made movie, gives you a huge amount of insight into what it must have been like for them going through that part of the war, and it also covers a little bit of like them enlisting children to fight for the Nazi party when they're just completely out of people to fight for them. It's kind of crazy, very good movie. Then there's a movie called Empire of the Sun, which is about a British family living in Shanghai, and Japan invades China and basically captures this kid who's played by Christian Bale as a kid at the time, and he basically grows up in a Japanese internment camp during World War II. It's pretty intense. It's very interesting, and it covers a little bit of the kamikaze aspect of the war too. Really good movie, but not a lot of combat or portrayal of battles or anything like that. Now, going back a little bit further to 1970, the film Patton is still an incredibly good watch. It portrays the General George S. Patton during World War II, who was put in charge of a lot of our African campaign and then took responsibility in Europe as well. Some big tank battles in that movie, portraying big tank and air battles and stuff in Africa and later in the war. It's in part character study on the General Patton himself, who's just such a crazy character, and focuses a bit more on his motivational techniques or the way he was portrayed in the media than the specific combat strategies themselves. But it's still a really interesting watch and does show a little bit of the tank combat in the African theater of war, although the tanks themselves I don't think are the actual tanks that were used in the battle. But considering the time frame of the movie when it was made, I think I'm a little bit more lenient on some of the vehicle accuracy that was used. Now, if you want to dive into the Holocaust aspect of World War II, there's of course some great movies on it. Not really that pertinent to Battlefield 5, but it is important to understand the atrocities behind this war, and we are playing a video game that glorifies war and probably will gloss over these aspects of the war, so it is important for us to sort of remind ourselves about the serious atrocities of this war and some of the things that happened. The movie Life is Beautiful is probably my top recommendation if you're gonna try and make it through one Holocaust related film. It's about a Jewish Italian and his son who basically get shipped off to a concentration camp, and it's about the father trying to protect his young son from the atrocities of what's going on around them by creating a game out of it. It's a really, really good movie, and it's incredibly tragic and hard to watch at times, but I recommend that one above all others. Of course, there's Schindler's List, which I imagine many of you are also familiar with. Another really good movie about Oskar Schindler and him using his factory to try and save Jews from being shipped off to concentration camps. Then there's the movie The Pianist, which is about a Jewish-Polish pianist who basically avoids concentration camps by hiding out in Warsaw after Germany invades Poland. And it's, again, a very beautiful, tragic, hard-to-watch movie, but incredibly good. Now, there's a few World War II action movies that I would not consider to be particularly good, but if you really want to watch some action movies around certain battles or certain theaters of war, here's a few of them. There's Red Tails, which focuses on an African-American fighter squadron that was sent in to back up our B-17 bombers. This could have been an awesome film, but unfortunately the combat and storyline is very, very hokey. The combat looks like it was something out of a mediocre arcadey video game. The air combat is just ridiculous. So if you want historical accuracy or air combat accuracy, definitely not a movie to watch. There's another movie called Memphis Belle, which is a little bit of an older film, and it focuses on a B-17 bomber crew. I found it interesting because it gets into sort of the survival rates and survival statistics of some of these bomber crews, which is just abysmal, terrifying really to think about. The movie itself is unfortunately a bit campy at times, but if you want a movie on a bomber crew, this is one of the few ones out there. If you already watched Das Boot and you really want another World War II submarine movie, there's U-571, which is about an American submarine crew tasked with capturing the Enigma code machine that the Germans used to send secret transmissions during the war. Unfortunately, though, it kind of covers a plot line in which the British were actually the ones that recovered the first Enigma machine, and this one's in a way discrediting them, so that part of it is awkward as it's not a historically accurate film. And in addition to that, the idea that a small American submarine crew could also pilot a German U-boat is pretty ridiculous, but the action is fun, and if you can get past the insane inaccuracies of the movie, it's fun. It's decent production quality. Now, I have a few on the list of movies that I really need to watch, some older ones that are fairly iconic World War II movies. There's The Longest Day, The Bridge Over the River Kwai, Come and See, and then I also mentioned the German film Stalingrad from 1993. So if you guys have any more recommendations, probably foreign film recommendations on good portrayals of battles fought in World War II, I would love to hear about those in the comments down below. Let me know what you think about my recommended movies here, if you have any you want to add to that list. And as always, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time. This is Level Cap signing off.